Okay, welcome everyone. I will get started. Thank you so much for joining us all, and a very warm welcome, especially to Starhawk. Thank you so much for your time, and we're really looking forward to your talk and to this conversation tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University, which is hosting this event. This event is part of a series that we're running at IRCPL called the Magic Series, which began last fall. We had hoped to have Starhawk present in the fall, but postponed to the spring because of the graduate student workers strike. Out of solidarity with that has been now successfully resolved, which we're all very happy about. But this Magic Series is going to be running over this academic year and into the fall of 2022. So far, we have featured the historian Silvia Federici. We had a panel last semester on the theme and question of decolonizing magic, whether magic is a term or always a term which is in some way compromised or shaped by colonial projects. Tonight, of course, we have Starhawk joining us, and we have more events coming up later this spring, which I hope you will join us for, and you can find more information on our website, and we can circulate that also in the chat. But tonight we are incredibly pleased to have Starhawk with us. Starhawk is someone whose work I've been reading for several years and found much generative insight coming out of. I assume that she is well known to most of you because we have had a record registration for this event. I've been directing IRCPL now for 4 years, and I've never seen the interest as we have tonight in hearing Starhawk speak to us. Well over 500 people have registered for this event, which is a testament to the interest in the issues that she will be talking about, and also the incredible record and set of contributions that Starhawk has made to our understandings of magic, ecofeminism, and a number of other causes and concerns. Starhawk is the author of numerous books. I'm not going to list them all. I'm just going to pick out a few of the ones that have been especially notable to me. They include The Spiral Dance, which I think now is well into its fifth decade, right? It must be at least 40 years since The Spiral Dance was first published. Dreaming the Dark, Magic, Sex, and Politics. And another that was co-authored with Anne Hill and Diane Baker called Circle Round, Raising Children in the Goddess Tradition. She is a prolific author of not only, I suppose it would be called nonfiction, but I'm not sure that's the right framing, but also of fiction. She speaks very widely, both in the United States and abroad. And as I hope we'll get into later on, something I want to bring up with her in conversation, has had a very distinctive and I think important influence within the secular academy, if I can refer to it that way. I'm coming to you here, we are coming to you here from the platform of a university, and you know, there are ways in which the kind of work and the kinds of contributions to our understandings of society and the world and the workings of the world by figures such as Starhawk, let's say, have not always been welcomed into the ivory tower. But there are ways in which I think her work has been very influential and generative, and I'll want to have us speak about that. Before moving on to let her deliver her talk, which is entitled Magic, Reason, and Magical Thinking, let me just say a few more things, mostly in terms of thanks and housekeeping. Thanks, in terms of thanks, I want to um, uh, um, thank my colleagues at IRCPL, especially Mariana Pecoraro, who runs these online events for us, but also the rest of the team, Walid Hammam and Madeline De Jesus, who make everything at IRCPL possible. I also want to thank Diane Baker, who I mentioned a minute ago, and who's someone I got to meet a few years ago here in New York City and have had some fantastic conversations with over the past few years. And it was through Diane that we were able to make this connection to Starhawk. So I'm very grateful to you, Diane, for that. In terms of the structure of this evening, Starhawk is going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, again, on this topic of magic, reason, and magical thinking. I will then engage her in some conversation and exchange, but then we're going to open it up to questions from you all in the audience. In order to pose your questions, can I ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen? You should be able to type in your questions there. We will be able to see those, and I will read them out to Starhawk towards the end as part of the Q&A. You can either give us your name or not. If you want to ask a question anonymously, that's absolutely fine. But also feel free at any point during the course of the proceedings, from the moment Starhawk starts speaking up until the moment we end, to type in your question. You obviously don't have to wait to ask your question if something comes up in the midst of her talk that you want to kind of articulate before the thought escapes you. Please just put it in the Q&A, and it will form part of the question queue. So without further ado, let me turn over to Starhawk again. Thank you so much for joining us and for this lecture or talk on magic, reason, and magical thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I want to thank you and everybody at the Institute for putting this on and for all your great support and all the work that you do. And also thanks to my dear friend Diane, who introduced us. I would say we have been friends since sometime in the 70s, and it's really wonderful to have relationships that can go back for such a long time, and we're still friends. So that's a real gift. I am speaking to you today. I want to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Kashaya Pomo, who are the original peoples of the land where I am, otherwise known as Western Sonoma County in Northern California. There's a long heritage here of knowledge, of spiritual wisdom, of some incredible stories of healing and amazing healers among the Pomo. There's also a heritage of colonization that goes back to the Russians, because this was the area, the furthest south the Russians got on the West Coast, and then later the Spanish and the Californians and the Americans. But also to acknowledge and celebrate the Kashaya are still here. They haven't disappeared or gone anywhere, and in fact, in recent years, have managed to recover 500 acres of land on the coast and have access once again to some of their hereditary gathering grounds. For me, I like to try to be a good guest on this land and just acknowledge the incredible gift and privilege I feel to be able to be here in this beautiful place. I encourage you all to know the original peoples of the land that you're on, wherever that may be, and honor and respect the peoples who have been here for so long before most of us and most of our ancestors. I'll start maybe just by telling a little bit of my background and my story. I guess there's sort of two two streams of roots for this journey that I've been on. One is my family background and heritage in the Jewish tradition, which I grew up in and had a lot of Jewish education and practice. My grandparents were Orthodox. My parents were the generation who rebelled. But the other stream is the stream of psychology and psychotherapy because both of my parents were social workers, and my mother was a psychotherapist, and my father was a group worker. He died when I was quite young, so she was more of a direct influence on me. But I think of myself as the adult child of psychotherapists, and that has contributed a lot to the way I see the world. I was very interested in questions of, you could say, religion, philosophy, why are we here? All those deep questions as a child and as a teenager. Maybe because losing my father at such an early age just made me aware that life can be very short and to really wonder about what's its purpose, what's its meaning, what comes afterwards. I found some answers in the Jewish tradition, but I also found, especially at that era, the 50s and early 60s, there wasn't really much space in the Judaism of the time for women to take roles of leadership. It was before the days of any women rabbis or cantors. And as I began exploring in my teenage years and college years in the late 60s, which was, of course was the time of, all of those revolutions in consciousness, of new interest in Eastern philosophies and a new attempt to really take them seriously and learn from them. It was the era of sex, drugs, rock and roll, all of that. And I found that my own actual spiritual experiences primarily happened in nature. When I was a freshman in college, I went to UCLA. I was taking a course on anthropology, and as part of that, my friend Patty and I decided that we would do a project on witches. And we actually met some people who called themselves witches. It was like, whoa, are they real? Is this a real thing, not just like a sort of wonderful fantasy or scary fantasy? And what they told us was that witchcraft, as they experienced it and practiced it, was the ancient pre-Christian pagan religion of Europe and with its roots going back into the Middle East and beyond. And that it celebrated nature, that nature was sacred, that sexuality was sacred, and that it was a religion centered on the goddess. And that to me was like an illuminating concept. I had never really thought about seeing God, seeing deity, seeing whatever that thing is as female. It was always in the Bible and the Torah, it was always he, and never really thought about what that actually meant, how that felt to me, um, viscerally, bodily, energetically, to imagine that you could conceive of the divine in the same kind of form that I had. And so I was like, this is for me, right? This is what I've always like believed. This gives a framework for what I have actually experienced. And we began studying and training, and then, life changed. I was quite young and ended up leaving LA, breaking up with my boyfriend at the time, setting off on a bicycle journey around, first on the West Coast and then down the East Coast. I spent a winter in New York, um, staying not far from Columbia University. In that. And eventually came back to the West Coast. And that was also being by then the mid 70s, it was also the era of the revival of the feminist movement. And before I left LA, I'd been very involved with a group of women in a consciousness raising group in the Women's Center in Venice, in that neighborhood of LA where I lived. And it always seemed to me that should be some connection between feminism and a religion that celebrated a goddess. Um, First, it didn't seem like it occurred to anybody else that they should go together, because the feminism of that time tended to be very, religion is the opiate of the people, religion is patriarchal. Uh, there's nothing in religion for women. Um, but I met other people, including there was a woman named Z Budapest, who had a shop called the Feminist Wicca, who had a lot of women she was doing rituals with and magic with. And eventually I moved up to San Francisco and met a wonderful community there of people who were pagan and also oriented toward social change and toward activism, which had also been something I'd been involved in since my high school days when we were protesting the Vietnam War. I began thinking and teaching and writing, and really I have been doing that for half century or more. And as part of that, working with this concept of magic. I have to say, in recent years, I've wondered whether I wouldn't have done better to have spent 50 years trying to teach people the skills of critical thinking. But I actually think that if you really understand what we mean by magic, it encompasses many of the skills that we need to make sense of the world that we're in today, this tremendously confusing world where we are bombarded by information, by opinion, by emotion constantly, and where very few of us had the kind of education or the kind of training that fits us for really figuring out what to believe and what not to believe, where we're immersed in systems that are immensely large and feel beyond our control, and again, often have a hard time sorting out where we can have an impact and where we can't. So I'm going to say a little bit about how I define magic and also how I define magical thinking. Um, when people say magical thinking, they're often using it in a disparaging way. It tends to mean wishful thinking or denial. You know, I've indulged in it. For example, I really tend to have a deep inner belief that as long as I don't check the oil in my truck, I don't have to worry about whether I have oil in there or not. This is not a kind of thinking that really serves you well in the real world over time. And eventually, with that kind of magical thinking, you end up stuck out in the woods somewhere with your engine seized up and no little bars to get hold of AAA to tow you out of it. So magical thinking of that kind, you could say the ostrich thinking, does not really serve us. Um, the opposite of that, you might think, would be the kind of magical thinking that overinflates our power. I hear a lot of people in the New Age world saying things like, thoughts are things, or, um, you know, what you resist persists. Or, if you think about it, you name it, somehow you are creating it. And that kind of New Age idea of I can create my own reality. For one thing, that is a tremendously privileged view of the world. Right? Um, Very few people in history have ever had the illusion that they could simply create the reality that they wanted. And if unless you are born into a certain level of money and privilege and access, it's pretty clear to you from an early age that you can't really just wish things into being or create just what you want. But like most fallacies, there's some nugget of truth in that. You know, it is true that the way you perceive the world and the way will affect the way you show up in the world, and the way you show up in the world often will have an impact on what the world gives back to you. But while you're sitting there trying to mentally create your own reality, you're dealing with a world where there's a lot of other forces also creating that reality, some of which are physical, some of which are other people's desires and goals. And it's really not, doesn't boil down to being that simple. That kind of magical thinking also is quite, I think, ultimately quite distressing, because if you actually can create reality just by thinking about it, like where does your responsibility ever end? You know, I wish I could just think Putin out of invading Ukraine, but I can't. And believe me, if I could, I would. Um, but if I could and he invaded Ukraine anyway, or I believed that I could, then how much responsibility would I have to feel for his actions? So that kind of thinking can literally drive you crazy. So um, that whole constellation of things we might call magical thinking is something we really do better to avoid. So what is the difference with that and what I like to call magic? The definition that I've always loved for magic comes from a writer named Dion Fortune, who was an occultist in the early part of the 20th century. She said, magic is the art of changing consciousness at will. And I like to approach it that way because I think there's a lot in that definition that reflects magic, you could say, as in some ways a branch of psychology. Um, or maybe it's that edge where psychology, spirituality, religion all meet. Among other things, I'm a permaculture teacher and designer, and permaculture, which is a whole system of ecological design that works with nature to help us um, create things that will meet our human needs while actually regenerating the world around us. You know, we have a set of principles that derive from ecological principles, and one of them is the principle of edge, that where two different systems meet, you get a third system that often is more diverse and more dynamic than either of the other two. So if, you know, where the ocean meets the shore, you get all these different kinds of niches for life, you know, rocky places and sandy places and places where the waves thunder in and places where the sea comes in more gently, you know, places that are underwater all the time except maybe for once a year, and other places that are exposed twice a day. And all of those differences create different niches for life. So you can think of magic as one of those fertile edges between psychology, spirituality, and religion. Um, Magic as the art of changing consciousness at will, in the sense of its links to psychology, I'd say is closest to some of the forms of psychology like neurolinguistic programming, like body oriented therapies, like dialectical behavioral therapy. because it's really about this process of acknowledging first that human beings have many different types of consciousness available to us. And um, we're not just stuck in one approach, one sort of consciousness, one way of viewing and looking at the world. Um, that might be insight number one of magic. Insight number two might be that we can learn to be aware of what state of consciousness we're in. And that's part of a magical practice or a magical discipline, is that it is a process of self-awareness. It has to begin with self-awareness. And to me, that is part of our inoculation against the destructive types of magical thinking, because a lot of magical thinking comes from our human tendency to believe what we want to believe. And magical training is about acknowledging that, looking at that, saying, okay, I want to believe, like, I want to believe that I don't need to go to the dentist because I don't like going to the dentist. So if I believe that my teeth are going to be fine as long as I don't have someone go tell me they're not, or that I don't need to go get a mammogram because as long as I don't know, then I'm not going to have cancer. Any of those things, and probably if we're honest, all of us have at one time or another made choices and decisions on that kind of thinking. You know, um, you know, in order to avoid that, we have to be honest about what we want, and we have to recognize what we want, and we have to recognize that tendency in ourselves. Uh, I think that's especially important right now when we have so much information. There's so much information about, the pandemic, about the virus, about the vaccines, and to really like stop and say, hey, am I believing in something because it fits what I want to believe? That's not always wrong, but it's always something to be aware of and to really evaluate and look at closely. Have I made this choice about my health care because I have really honestly looked at all the research and um, closely evaluated all the different options and talked to healthcare professionals I respect about it? Or do I have an emotional attachment to a certain belief and look for things that are going to reinforce that? So I don't know about you, but I do that all the time about things. Again, my father, who died of a heart attack when I was 5, my mother said he was a chain smoker, and my mother said he always went to doctors who were chain smokers. And of course, that was back in the 50s before there was the hard evidence about smoking and cancer. But again, we all have that tendency to do that. So part of our magical practice begins with self-awareness, with really acknowledging what our desires are, what our tendencies are. And again, not necessarily saying that makes our beliefs or understandings wrong, but it always makes us stop and look at them more closely. So the third insight of magic, besides that we have different states of consciousness available, that we can become aware of them, the third insight might be that we can learn to make conscious choices about what state of awareness we are in. Um, if you get into one of those inner loops around something like uh, how bad everybody is to me and what a victim I am, and why is everything so bad and why is everything going wrong, one of those dialogue things that circle and go round and round and round and round and round. Part of magical training is learning to stop those things and learning that you can make a choice, that you don't have to be caught in those assumptions, and giving you tools for making that choice and shifting your awareness in different ways. And finally, I'd say the fourth insight of magic, I'd say those first three are probably not that controversial in some ways. They're very close again to many schools of psychology, to many schools of religion, to meditation. I'd say especially Buddhist meditation that talks about awareness and consciousness. Those are not unique to magical training. Oh, magic training puts them together in a certain way, right? But the fourth insight, which might be more of a controversy, is that those different states of consciousness, especially when your awareness is trained and focused and directed, can cause change in the material world, in the world around you. Now, again, there's certain ways in which that is pretty obvious. You know, if you want to do anything, let's say you want to pass your course in religion at Columbia, right? In magic, we talk about first needing to have an intention. So knowing what your intention is, is your intention, I want to get a good grade so I can go on to graduate school? Is your intention, I want to learn this material because I really want to wrestle with these questions and have an impact on my life? Is your intention, I want to get a really good grade in this class to show my ex-lover who's in the same class that I am smarter than they are? We can have many types of different intentions. That intention is going to have us marshal energy in a certain way. If your intention is to really wrestle deeply with the questions, you'll probably do the reading, you'll read beyond that, you'll think about those things, you'll engage in a certain way. If your intention is just to get a good grade, you might do just what you have to do to get the good grade without really experiencing some of the gifts that you might if you had a deeper intention. Then when you know what your intention is, in magic, there's the art part of magic. And the art part of magic is this art of turning abstract concepts into concrete, sensual images and things. In that way, magic is akin to poetry or any other art. But I always think about William Carlos Williams, the poet, who said, no ideas, but in things. So no abstract concepts in his view of poetry, but they must be concrete images, things you could see, smell, taste, touch, because those are the things that really move us emotionally, and they speak to a different part of the self than the abstract, intellectual, verbal mind. So again, if your intention in your religion course is to really wrestle with those things, gain something out of it, you might have an image for that. Something that's sensual. You might imagine it as savoring the apple of knowledge, and something you can imagine how an apple smells with that beautiful fresh sweetness, how it feels to crunch into a really crispy apple with your teeth, and how it feels on your tongue. And when you start to do that, it activates feelings inside yourself. And you might say, okay, every time I begin to do my religion reading, I'm going to imagine I'm taking a bite of this incredible apple. And that apple, that symbol, that sensual image then creates a focus for you to focus your energy, your will, your work, your commitment. And if you do that enough, then when you visualize that apple, you're going to start to feel like concentrating and thinking and grappling and wrestling with these wonderful ideas that are there in your course and in your readings. So that's kind of a little bit about how actually magic works. Now, when we say that focused and concentrated attention can shift the reality around us beyond, it's clear that it does that for ourselves. It shifts the way we show up. If you're doing that with your religion homework, I would bet you anything you'll end up with a pretty good grade in the course and really learning something from the course. Whether we can shift the reality of other people, the consciousness of other people, could we shift the mood of the country with directed, focused, magical energy? I don't know. It's really hard to run, scientific trials with things like magic, but I think it might be actually worth trying at this point. And I think that there's tremendous interest in all of this, I think because people feel so strongly that we are in a toxic sort of emotional, spiritual, psychic environment, and it needs a lot of shifting. There's people who've done this experiment, like Dion Fortune, who in World War II, she and her group um, really did focused meditation and experiments to help the morale of the British people throughout the Blitz and throughout the war. She wrote about it in a book called The Magical Battle of Britain. Though I must warn you that Dion Fortune had all of the sort of the racism and anti-Semitism of her time and class. So you have to be prepared to wade through some of that. But if you do, she has a lot of really interesting magical ideas. There are stories about how the witches of Britain raised a cone of power to prevent Hitler from invading. Um, and there are, many, many tales and stories from around the world from many different cultures of different kinds of spiritual and magical resistance. But again, it is unfortunately not as simple as like waving a wand and making everything change, because whatever spiritual energetic forces you are marshaling are going to be running up against a lot of spiritual energetic forces maybe being marshaled in opposition. So it's not like a simple, easy guarantee of victory. Um, Magic is also a set of tools and skills, again, for accessing and shifting consciousness. And I think I'd like to finish up, if it's all right with you, by actually teaching you one of them, the one that I use most consistently every day and beginning every ritual. It's kind of like, basic first position if you're in ballet, and basic bar work that you do over and over and over again. And it's called grounding. And it's a way of bringing yourself into a state where you can be present, where you can be energetically present, where you can release tension and anxiety, where if you're in a dangerous situation, you can not panic. I've taught this to activists and people who are going into some very dangerous situations, sometimes coming up against the military and sometimes uh, situations with riot police and stuff who were, that were going to be very intense. And it's always helpful. People always say, don't panic. Well, it's always helpful not to panic, but they don't always tell you how do you not panic. So this is how you not panic. But it's also, I think, really important when you're just reading the news these days. When you're at the playground with your kid and suddenly you notice they're standing up at the top of the slide, about to lose their balance. Um, when You open your email and get an unexpected bill for something you forgot that you put on your credit card, you know, any of those things. It really helps to be grounded. And on the positive side, if you're going out into nature, if you are out in the woods, if you're about to go out into your garden, if you're about to meet, you know, someone you really love and are happy to spend time with, it's also helpful to be grounded so you can really be fully present and fully aware. So to do this, just take a deep breath. You can close your eyes if you want to. Put your hands on your belly and take some deep breaths down so you're using your diaphragm, you're feeling it push out as you inhale and push in as you exhale. Take a moment and just relax your body. Notice where you're carrying tension. And maybe imagine yourself like a tree, standing or sitting with roots that go down into the earth from the base of your spine, from your feet and legs, down through all the layers of soil, mud, rock, down through the bedrock, down through the waters that are held under the earth. Push them down all the way to that core of fire at the heart of the earth. It's still hot from the Earth's formation. If there's anything you want to release or let go of, just take a breath and let it go down through those roots into that fire and be transformed into pure creative energy. And then taking a deep breath, imagine drawing a spark of that energy up through all those different layers of the earth, up into your feet and legs, to the base of your spine, your belly. Feel your spine begin to stretch and grow like a flexible tree trunk. And breathe it up into your heart. And up into your shoulders, up into your arms. Reach up to the sky, sweep back down, touch the earth. And feel the sunlight on those leaves and branches. Or maybe where you are, it's more like moonlight or starlight or twilight or street lights. But feel some of that sky energy and bring that down, breathe it down. Down through the leaves and branches, down through the top of your head, down to your heart, your hands, your belly, and down through your legs and feet into the earth. And just feel that flow of energy through you, coming up and around and coming down. And then let's just take a moment and bring ourselves into our physical senses. Notice how your body is feeling, sitting, how the air feels on your skin. Take a deep sniff in, notice what you smell. Maybe what you taste. Open your ears and notice what you're hearing. Open your eyes and notice what you see. Take a moment, notice how it feels to focus on the screen and the little squares. And then for a moment, let your eyes roam around the room, broaden your vision. Look at all that you're not taking in. And then just take a breath and notice how it feels to be present and be grounded. So I know we want to have some time for conversation and for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Starhawk, for that talk and for that guided meditation and exercise. And it speaks to one of the aspects of why I think we thought it was so important to invite you to speak in this series, which is picking up on a, a, a very kind of prominent theme in your work, and also ways in which, as I was referring to at the outset, the secular academy understands itself as being about the life of the mind and not necessarily having anything to do with the body. And if you look at the ways in which certain structurings of academic work are organized, there is this sense that we have to think in terms of disembodied states. And I think one of the things that your work points out so well is the impossibility of disconnecting the spiritual or the immaterial from the embodied or the material, right? And also the ways in which it pushes against an idea of a kind of natural supernatural distinction. So thank you for that. So yeah, it leads me into, I definitely want to get to, we do have some questions building up, and let me just remind the audience to please feel free to add questions at any time. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But I do want to get to the themes that you raised and the differentiation between especially magic and magical thinking. And of course, the talk and the talk title in your presentation had that bridging term of reason, magic, reason, and magical thinking. And of course, as you pointed out, we tend to think of magical thinking, or there are forms of magical thinking which seem to be understood as kind of irrational or unreasonable, unrealistic, maybe. And it seemed, I got the sense that you were trying to kind of clearly differentiate this and suggest the ways in which, of course, the practice of magic is not antithetical to an understanding of reason or rationality. And I wondered if you could just expand a bit on that. What in your understanding of how ought we to understand reason? How would you define reason in relation to what to your practice?
I would say that reason is one of those states of consciousness available to human beings, and it's an important one. It's the one that is really about our understanding of physical reality and its laws, its causes, its effects, its impacts, and you know, it's that kind of state of consciousness, that reason, of science, of evidence-based thinking. We wouldn't be talking to each other on this Zoom call, right? If we didn't live in a world heavily shaped by that. So again, in magic, we don't really say, um, you know, get rid of reason. What we say is understand it's one important state of consciousness we might choose to be in that has its uses. And there are times when we need it, and there are other times when we might need another state of consciousness. If I'm out in the woods, there might be times when I just want to be in blissful contemplation of the beauty of the trees, you know, and be in that state of consciousness. And there might be other times where I want to be making some decisions about how I'm going to thin and prune and limb some of them up and make a shaded fuel break and reduce the danger of wildfire coming through. And they're both useful. But if we kind of understand that, we can make a choice. And I can say, all right, I'm going to do that. But I'm also, when I'm just taking my walk, I'm going to not be thinking every moment about all the work I need to be doing out here in the woods. I'm going to allow myself just to commune with the trees. And I have some tools for shifting back and forth.
Thank you for that. It picks up on another thing that I wanted to ask you about and get your reflections on. I mentioned in an earlier conversation that I teach your work to 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 college students and to graduate students, often within a kind of larger context of work that is more, let's say, kind of removed from the practice of magic, but kind of looking at magic from the outside with varying levels of sympathy and antipathy, of credulity and incredulity. I mean, there are ways in which academic accounts from the 19th century onwards, and even before, but engage with magic either with a kind of skepticism or disdain, or a certain kind of, but also in some cases a kind of appreciation or respect. But teaching your work in the context of a university setting kind of always, I think, throws the students a little bit, because it's in a register and asking questions in a way that kind of doesn't conform to what the academic syllabus might otherwise be expected to demand. And I think that's it's certainly been a very generative aspect of teaching, because it allows us to look at scholarship, the scholarship otherwise. And this is something that you have touched on in various ways in your writings. In the Spiral Dance, you say you're interested in history, and you provide a sense of your understanding of connections to a pagan past, but you don't claim to be a historian, right? I mean, and you're quite clear about that. But I wonder if I could ask you I mean, it's not so much a personal question, but just a question that I have a great curiosity about, which is that, how much of the academic literature on magic do you read, or have you read? How, in what ways is it important or not important to you to say, parse the difference between James Fraser's understanding of magic in The Golden Bough and Tanya Luhrmann's in Persuasions of the Witch's Craft, or whatever it may be? I'm just curious about your kind of reading practices with that body of literature, which is in a sense kind of turning its lens
Mm-hmm.
onto practices and traditions with which you identify.
I would say, well, I would say there's different types of literature about magic. There is the type of literature that's written by practitioners, that it's sort of the how to do it, like the Dion Fortune stuff, or things like Caton Matthews, or um, a lot of different people that are talking about how we actually do magic, how we do ritual, some of even the old psychic, Madame Blavatsky, and Uspensky and all of those things. And I would say I read a lot more of that maybe earlier in my life. Um, and then there's sort of more the academic scholarship of magic and critique of magic. And I've read some of that. I don't tend to read a lot of that. At this point in my life, because I'm teaching so much permaculture, my nonfiction reading tends to be things like, uh, the carbon farming solution and stuff about, forest gardening and compost making and soil biology, which is fascinating. Um, and then there's also history. And I have been reading a lot of history lately, not so much necessarily about magic, but about culture and religion. Um, Sabina, you had Sabina, um, not Sabina, you had, sorry, I'm having one of those scenes.
Sylvia
Oh, yeah,
Federici.
Sylvia
Yeah.
Federici. Yeah, I think her work is quite brilliant on sort of the whole sociological, economic, uh, impact of the witch persecutions and what that meant in Western culture and how that actually shaped this dichotomy we have between reason and magic. There's another incredible writer, David Kubrin, who has a book out called Marxism and Witchcraft. And he was a very early influence. He's a good friend, but I heard him speak somewhere back in the late 80s. He gave a talk on Marxism and witchcraft that really set me off on the whole history that eventually got into Dreaming the Dark around the impact of the witch persecutions and what that meant in terms of ecology and in terms of sociology. David Graeber and David Wengrove's new book, uh, A Short History of Everything, which is really looking at the history of inequality, or really the question of whether we can look at the history of inequality, um, again, is brilliant uh, and looks a lot at um, some of these larger questions about culture and assumptions. David Graeber's work in general, he's an anthropologist. He wrote a book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and written many other works. And really, sadly, he died a couple of years ago at a very young age. But he's someone whose work always made me look at these questions in a different light. So I would say I tend to read more history and anthropology. I've also been reading a lot of history of the Middle East and ancient Sumer and ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, um, which has long been an interest of mine. I've written about it. I made a film with Donna Reed Cooper on Maria Gimbutas, who is the archaeologist who did a lot of the research on the old goddess religions. Um, but I'm finding now really enjoying reading a lot that just puts it in the whole broad context of the development of what we like to call civilization in that part of the world.
Thank you. Fantastic. That's just again very intriguing to hear, and I think David Graeber, who was a colleague and friend for many years, would be very touched to know that you read his work, and he has written also on magic and sorcery in Madagascar,
Wow.
which is really fascinating work. But um, I, uh, I want to just ask a few more questions before turning over to the audience. One is actually kind of continuing with this theme of your relation to the academy. Again, given that I know you give a lot of talks, many at universities, but many, outside the context of universities, but indulging us here, since we are,
Yeah.
within the Zoom orbit of a university. Um, your work has been picked up by some very prominent academics in science and technology studies, in queer theory, in various strands of philosophy and critical theory. I'm thinking of the work of people like Paul Preciado. I'm thinking also of Bruno Latour, and also Isabel Stengers, who I noticed you have engaged with directly.
Mhm.
Um, and these are all figures who are incredibly influential and generative of a set of ideas and a certain set of approaches within the academy, some more than others, playing with the limits of again how we understand um, t- subjects like the natural and the supernatural, really want to kind of challenge those dichotomies or those binaries, wanting to challenge the ways in which we understand agentive forces in the world, right? That we can't only think of agency as located within human subjects, but even within objects. And again, this gets back to some of the issues I was raising earlier about your your kind of interest in blurring the line between the material and the immaterial, or the animate and the inanimate. But I wondered, are you this conversation that you had? I think it was last year with Isabel Stengers. I would just be really curious to kind of hear your reflections on that, on those kinds of engagements, and also a sense of how often it is that you are that your perspectives and approach and wisdom and offerings are how often do you hear from academic anthropologists and historians and philosophers and science and technology
Mhm.
people directly? I mean, do you have relationships or conversations ongoing with some of these figures, or I'm just curious about the connections.
Well, I think it actually would be wonderful if we had ongoing, more deep philosophical discussions. Um, but I can't honestly say that we do a whole lot. But Isabel and I we gave a talk together at this amazing place called Lazade in France, which is this whole area where people have been resisting the building of an airport really since the 60s. But over, the last 10, 15 years, a group of, activists had made alliance with the local farmers, and they had really taken over this whole rural area and turned it into an autonomous zone. And when we were there, which was, I think, 2018, um, they were having gatherings. They had ongoing farms and gardens and permaculture. They had done some incredible natural buildings. It was really this whole alternative society that was so amazing and so visionary, because it bridged sort of this world of these, like, far left anarchist activists and these very traditional farmers. And so we were asked to give a lecture together um, on some of these issues. And then I actually did a ritual there, which was unusual because generally, the French are extremely devoted to reason and very uncomfortable with any of the spirituality, although I think that is changing now. some of my books have been published in French now, and I think there's much more of an interest in that. So, but I can't honestly say I've engaged a lot with many of those people that you have named or mentioned, and it would probably be interesting to do so.
Absolutely. Well, I hope, maybe we can arrange something at some point. That would be fantastic. But let me go to the questions now from the audience, because we have a lot of them building up, and thank you all. And I already know, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to get to at least some. The first question I will focus on is from Natina Gilbert. She writes, I was interested in your description of self-awareness as a way of becoming cognizant of our tendency to quote unquote believe what we want to believe. But I'm curious about those who perhaps have never turned inward or made a conscious practice or attempt at articulating their desires, and might have the sensation of not being able to necessarily examine the various threads that make up their constructed beliefs. Does the practice of magic offer a space or have any account for this kind of confusion or illegibility of desire and or belief? Or might this element of the unstable be a consistent part of practicing? Sorry, the unstatable. Sorry, let me read that again. Or might this element of the unstatable be a consistent part of practicing magic?
That's quite a deep question. I would say that it's one of those core questions that religion and psychology and magic have both sort of wrestled with. It's really like, how do we make people become more aware than they probably want to be? If somebody wants to be self-aware and has the willingness to do that work, there are many different disciplines for doing that. But for those who don't want to be self-aware, or don't even necessarily know that there's some value in it, um, I don't have a good simple answer. I wish I did. Um, we can give people information. Um, I've been trying to read and listen a lot. Right now, a lot of us are wrestling with the question of how do you deal with people who have now formed a core belief about something that you see as totally erroneous? How do you get through that? And it's not easy. Um, but one suggestion is asking questions, with how do you deprogram people from conspiracy theories? Telling them they're wrong doesn't work, just as any psychotherapist will tell you that if your patient is delusional, telling them that their belief is wrong will do nothing whatsoever. But the suggestion is maybe to ask questions that will lead people to maybe have a reason to examine their beliefs. So it's like, yes, uh, this small group of people is attempting to control the world. Who are they? What makes you think that? Um, what do you think their motivation is? How do you think they're actually doing it? Sometimes those things maybe can break through. We're just saying, you should be more self-aware. Does nothing whatsoever at all.
Thank you for that. So I'll go to the next question, which is from Sabrina Lee. Thank you so much for your talk. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about the word magic. I felt like some of your definitions of magic could be called critical thinking, the point about self-awareness, or mindfulness, the groundedness practice we did at the end. For you, is there a particular relationship between those practices to the word magic that is important to understand here?
Um, I use the word magic in a particular way, and for me, part of the reason is the connection to image, to imagination, um, because I think so much of the practice of magic is about activating the imagination, forming the images of what we want, that art part of shifting consciousness. And also, because I like the romance of it, I like taking it out a bit of that realm of academia and a certain kind of thought and into a realm that has a little bit more enchantment, a little bit more emotion attached to it. So I think when I'm talking about does encompass, there's sort of like a Venn diagram overlap with magic and mindfulness, with critical thinking, with all of those things.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Julian Sanchez Gonzalez. Could Starhawk please share a bit more on the role of ritual in the practice of magic? Could rituals bring us closer to the artistic nature of magic as described by Fortune?
Yes, I think ritual is an important part of magic. Um, Ritual has this sense of something that, a ritual can be something that is repeated. Um, but a ritual, to me, is a directed series of acts toward an intention that mobilizes emotion and mobilizes energy. And there are many reasons for ritual, but I don't think you could find any culture on earth that doesn't have some form of ritual. I think it's very core to us as human beings. Because when we create a ritual, we do a ritual around something. It's a way of saying this is something important. This is something to pay attention to. So if you do um, a ritual, if you just hook up with somebody, that can be great. But if you are saying we're going to make a life commitment to each other, we're going to have a relationship that at least our intention is to be a long-lasting one of support on multiple levels, then you might want to go through some kind of commitment ritual, whether that's a conventional marriage or something else that you create or a hand fasting. And that's can be very, very important to us as human beings. If somebody dies and there's nothing that happens around it, no ceremony, no memorial, no funeral, no nothing, there's something that just feels really wrong about that. And there's other reasons we might create ritual. We do ritual for the change of the seasons. It's saying like, hey, these cycles of nature are important. We should pay attention. They have resonance with us in many different ways. Um, we've also done rituals. David Kubrin, again, once said very early on, I remember he said, a ritual helps us face things together that are too hard to face alone. So, um, creating a ritual around something like a collective loss. I remember after September 11th, um, I was very involved in global justice activism at the time, and there was always a little tension between like the California groups and their pagan groups and the New Yorkers. The New Yorkers tended to be, we're New Yorkers, we're rational, right? uh, the hippies from California were like, hello, and the New Yorkers were like, we're New Yorkers. We don't hug, we shake hands. But after September 11th, I remember a group of the activists came to us and said, hey, would you do a ritual? Because we're all feeling this tremendous loss and just so much pain and grief and trauma. And we did. We created an action that was very much centered around ritual, um, because there was that need for it. So I think ritual is one of the tools of magic, and it's one of the ways we put together many of those techniques for shifting consciousness. You can put them together into a ritual that involves, again, um, setting a clear intention and having a clear set of images for focusing energy around that intention. I'm teaching an online course right now in ritual skills, which we had so many people sign up for it, we've had to close it, but I will probably teach it again sometime relatively soon. And, I always start with teaching people what is an intention. An intention, it tells you the why. Why are we doing this ritual? What's at stake? What's going to change if we do this or not do this? Um, and it sounds very simple, but it's taken me years and many years of nagging my community to say an intention is not like 5 pages of flowery poetic prose. An intention is like one clear sentence, um, that has like one coherent metaphor in it. And if you have that, then that gives you a thread to hang the whole ritual on. Uh,
This question on ritual is really fascinating. I just want to sneak in a kind of add-on question, which has to do with the 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 the, the modes of paying attention and the kind of dispositions toward either ritual, the practice of magic. Is Where do you see the balance, or can magic be done? I mean, does magic have to be done only kind of sincerely, or is there also a mode of magic which is ironic or something else? I mean, this speaks to the question of ritual, of course, because I think this is one of the things that uh, moderns are so uncomfortable with ritual, that it forces them to do something which suggests they have a sincere commitment to what is being said or danced out or whatever it may be. And yeah, so that tension between kind of sincerity and insincerity or irony, I mean, how do you see these playing out in the practice of magic?
Well, I think there's a difference between sincerity and belief. Um, I think it's helpful to have, like if you're doing a ritual, um, and you don't sincerely want the outcome of that ritual, you're not going to be directing much energy through it. Um, but that doesn't mean you have to have belief in the sense of a dogma, or even belief that this is going to work in a certain way. It's not so much about faith. Um, we often say it's about suspension of disbelief, like drama. You know, it's about saying, okay, well, what if, I don't know whether this meditation will make me feel better, but I sincerely want it to. I'm going to suspend my disbelief. I'm not going to try to deny it, because I think it's actually helpful in magic to have a certain skepticism, right? Um, and I'm not going to um, so much pretend I believe, but I'm just going to suspend my disbelief and say, well, what if I do it? And often with magic, the doing of it, it does actually work to shift your consciousness. We sometimes say, fake it until it gets real. Or Dion Fortune is always quoting the Jesuits who say, put yourself in the position of prayer and then you'll feel like praying. There's something about actually doing the actions which will help to bring the emotion along with it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to get to a few more questions. The next is from Angelo Antonio. Thank you for such an inspiring way of sharing. I'm thinking of your, Starhawk's, powerful contribution to the practice of consensus as an effective mode of inhabiting social life and pursuing commonality. What are the connections between magic and consensus? Could we think of consensus making as a mode of building consciousness, of building intentionality that is grounded in magic as a capacity to shape or act in the world?
Well, I think consensus in the sense of not just coming to agreement, but a particular process of decision making. For me, consensus often reflects a kind of group consciousness that it works best when a group has shared ideals or shared values and is willing to put forth ideas, and out of the sense of we as a group are working on this. We have an issue. We're going to put forth our best ideas, our visions, our concerns, our strong feelings, and we're going to see what we can craft together creatively that's going to best meet everybody's needs. And I have written a lot about that. I've written a book called The Empowerment Manual that's around um, the community dynamics and collaborative groups. I will say I'm less of a strict consensus person maybe than I once was. I actually think if people understand consensus doesn't have to mean 100% agreement. It means a commitment to going through that creative process together. Um, at the end of it, it doesn't matter so much whether you vote in the end or you don't vote if you go through that creative process of, again, hearing that full range of ideas and shaping something out of it together. And to me, that is a magical process in the sense that it requires people to have certain self-awareness. If you are devoted to having your idea win because you have a certain, personal insecurity that if you don't get your idea when you have no value as a person, um, you're not going to be a good consensus maker. But if you have a value that the group is going to create this kind of almost magical group mind together that will come up with the best solution for this issue that works for all of us, then sometimes amazing things can happen with consensus.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna read a question that kind of relates to this. You can maybe say a brief word, but it just kind of picks up on this theme, and so I wanted to kind of run with it a bit. It's from Rosa Zubizarreta. In David Graeber's TED Talk on the possibility of political pleasure, he talks about the sense of unity and diversity that can happen in a meeting. I love your writing on group facilitation and would love to hear you talk a bit about the shift in consciousness from me or we to me and we. Again, I mean, you've
Mhm.
probably addressed that. I don't know if there's anything else more you want to say about it, but I just wanted to kind of flag that there was other interest in the questions on this theme.
Yeah, David Graeber, he was also a good friend of mine. We met
Mm.
through activist circles and, we're in many meetings together. And and I would say one thing we shared, we both had a love and a fascination for meetings, even the dreadful ones, because at least in my mind, there's always something you can learn from them. But I will say that I think it helps to have a certain amount of skilled facilitation for a consensus meeting, especially a big and diverse one. And maybe that was one thing David and I disagreed on. He was part of founding, the original Occupy that happened in Zuccotti Park and was really devoted to these giant general assemblies. Um, and that was right when my empowerment manual was coming out. I had planned a book tour. I ended up going to something like a dozen different occupies all over the country, and I saw some of the best and some of the worst of human decision making happen there. Um, so I would say that to really make those things work, it does require people's willingness to make that shift, to say, okay, again, it's not about me getting my way. It's about us coming together, to synthesize everybody's ideas and visions. And that's a hard one for people to make sometimes. And it's hard to do that with people who maybe don't have the capacity to let go of their own needs enough to hold the needs of the whole community together. Um, but I think it does help to have some skill and have some training in helping that process to happen. Um,
Absolutely, yeah. Uh, yeah, I think faculty meetings could use skilled facilitators in the university context. I want to get to one more question before we wrap up, but before I get to it, let me just say some of the questions have asked about whether this will be recorded and shared, and also about other events in the series. Yes, this will be recorded and shared, so please do feel free to share the link. And the other events in the series you can either also watch online, or the upcoming ones come to see. So we will make sure that everyone who signed up for this gets that information via the email and the Eventbrite channel. So I just wanted to mention that. But let me go to the last question now, and it's from Aurora Sun. And she writes, as magic and witchcraft have become more popular in the United States and in other parts of the world, it feels as if it has been absorbed and largely co-opted by capitalism and colonization, and forces that, in absorbing magic, seem to be actively working to destroy magic's potency. Do you have thoughts on this, and how do you feel we can reject capitalism and colonization's attempt to capture magic?
yeah, I think that's a process that happens with almost anything in a capitalist society that has some intrinsic value. Is somebody is going to try to capitalize on it, and in doing so, it's going to shift what it's about and shift its value. I think the best way to resist that is by consciously continuing to practice magic in its truest sense, in the sense that feels truest to you, and to share that in ways that feel authentic, to teach it, to write about it, to create it in different ways, rather than to try to go on a crusade against the more shallow aspects of it. Because it is one of the magical principles is that we're stronger when we're working for something than when we're working against something. And so putting your attention into the deeper spiritual aspects of magical practice. And I saw another question there about, there is an aspect of it that feels like a lot of medieval role playing and sort of dress up silliness. And yeah, that is definitely true. Um, and that might be a gateway for some people into a much deeper and more real connection. And I think the way to resist that is to strengthen your own actual connection to nature, which is where this all comes from, to have your own relationship with the natural world, to try to, as much as you can, ground the spiritual practice in also having like a real life, hands in the dirt, um, actual practice of being in nature, whether that's, you know, hiking in the wilderness or whether that's like taking 5 minutes a day to go out on your back porch and look at what's going on in the trees and the yard, or if you don't have a back porch, it might be looking at what's growing in the cracks of the asphalt in the parking lot. But there's always something in nature to observe and connect to and feel part of. And when you take on some responsibility for actively tending the land or tending the environment around you and tending the community, to me, that's one of the best ways to ground your magical practice in something that is very real. And then
Well,
you love to dress up in medieval costumes and, you know, wave wands around, like, why not? Right?
well, Starhawk, thank you so much for this incredibly stimulating talk and conversation. And thanks to those of you who asked questions, and my sincere apologies in not being able to get to all of them. Some of them kind of overlapped with ones that were asked, but again, I'm sorry we're out of time. But thank you all again for attending, and Starhawk, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I should just say, if you want to learn more, you can go to my website, starhawk.org, and sign on to my mailing list, or go to earthactivisttraining.org if you're interested in some of our permaculture courses. We have a permaculture design course that you can still get into. It just started this week. And we have a short course you can also get into on permaculture for climate activists. So.
Hmm. Well, thank you. I think that might be of interest to some of the IRCPL community. Another series we're running is on religion and climate, and it occurred to me back when we invited you that it would have been just as easy and fitting to have you speak in that series as in this series, given your work. So thank you for flagging those interests for us. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Good night.